Section 3.5 Factoring Part 2. In example 4D, before we can factor this trinomial into two binomials, we need to look to see if we have a GCF. Always look to see if you have a GCF. There is not a common factor that goes into 12, 8, and 15. However, your first term is a negative, and you cannot have a trinomial with the first term be a negative. So we have to factor out a -1. When you factor out a -1, it changes the sign of all terms in the trinomial. Now, we can do the guess and check method, or what we can do is we're going to do the guess and check method first. We're going to list all the factors of 12. 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4. Factors of 15, 1 times 15, 3 times 5. We need to make our two binomials. Remember, if the last sign is negative, the signs are going to be different. So I am going to try the 3 and the 4. And I'm just guessing. I'm going to put 3x and 4x. And I'm going to try the 3 and the 5. Now my outside term is a -15x. And my inside is 12x, which is -3x. That is not my middle term. So I'm going to switch the 5 and the 3 around. So my outside is a -9 and a +20, which is 11, and that is not my middle term. I need 8. So now I'm going to try the 1 and the 15. My outside is a -45, and my inside is 4. That right away I know is not -8. So let's try the 15. Switch the 15 and the 1 around. The outside is a -3x. My inside is 60x. That is not 8x. So I have concluded that the 3 and the 5 is not going to work. The 3 and the 4, I mean. So now I'm going to try the 2 and the 6. With the 3 and the 5. So my outside is a -10. My inside is a +18, which is a +8x. And I want a -8x. So when you have the same middle term but the wrong sign, you just switch the signs around. Now look at this exact same trinomial. We're going to do what's called the AC method. When you have multiple factors of the first term of your A and multiple factors of your C, remember standard term is ax squared plus bx plus c. So that's what I'm talking about with A and C. What you do is you multiply the A and C together. 12 times 15 is 180. Now, look at the last sign. The last sign is negative. So we want to find factors that subtract to get the middle term of 8. And you just play around with your calculator and find factors. Now I know right off the bat that 10 times 18 or 18 times 10 is 180. And 18 minus 10 gives you 8. And that is my middle term. So I am going to split the middle term. And I want it to be a -8, so I'm going to put the negative with the 18 and the positive with the 10. It doesn't really matter which one you write first, but what matters is that the negative goes with the 18. So I just split the middle term to say -18 and a +10, because -18 and a +10 gives you -8. And then I factor by grouping. You group the first two together, group the last two together, and make sure that you have a plus sign in between. Now I'm going to factor out a GCF in the first group. My GCF in the first group is a 6x. 6x goes into 12x squared, 2x, times -6 goes into 18, 3, and the x's cancel. Bring down the plus sign. My GCF in the second group is a 5. and I get 2x minus 3. And notice these two binomials are identical. So 2x minus 3, I'm going to factor out a 2x minus 3. Kind of pull it out, they become 1, and what's left over is the 6x plus 5. Let's look at this one. Negative 8x squared plus 46x minus 30. First, I'm always going to ask myself, do I have a GCF? You always want to factor out a greatest common factor if you can. And there is a common factor that goes into 8, 46, and 30. 2. But because the first term's a negative, I have to factor out a negative 2. And 2 goes into 8 4 times. 2 goes into positive 46, a negative 23. Remember, when you factor out a negative, you change the sign. And negative 2 goes into negative 30, positive. Don't forget your x. And negative 2 goes into negative 30, positive 15 times. Now, I am just going to look at the 4x squared minus 23 plus 15. I'm going to ignore the negative 2 for just a moment. And I'm going to split the middle term by multiplying 4 times 15, and I get 60. Now, look at the last sign. The last sign is positive. So that means they are both going to be whatever the first sign is. They're both going to be negative. So I want to find factors of 60 that add up to get 23. 1 times 60, 2 times 30, 3 times 20. Right there, 3 times 20. If I added 3 and 20, I get 23. So I'm going to split the middle term, and they're both negative. So once again, it doesn't really matter which one you write first. A factor by grouping, group the first two together. You have to have that negative sign inside because you have to have a positive in between. My GCF in the first group is an x, and I get 4x minus 3. And my GCF in the second group is a negative 5, because remember, if your first term is a negative, you have to factor out a negative. So you could bring down the plus, but then it's plus a negative, where you can just write minus 5. Negative 5 goes into negative 20, positive 4x, and negative 5 goes into positive 15, a negative 3. Notice these two are identical. If they're not, you've done something wrong. So they become 1. You factor that 4x minus 3 out, and what do you get left over? X minus 5. Now, don't forget to bring down the negative 2. And that is your trinomial factored completely. Example 5, the zero product property. If AB is equal to 0, then that means A is equal to 0 and B is equal to 0. So in other words, if you have two factors and it's equal to 0, you take each factor and put each one equal to 0. And then you have two simple equations that you need to solve. These are also known as your x-intercepts. And another word for it is the roots. Those are also called roots. Number 1, we're going to practice. It says to solve. Well, you know that you're going to have two answers because your highest exponent is a 2. So that tells you how many answers you're going to have for x. You must put in standard form and put the equation equal to 0 before you can solve. So I have to move the 48x on this side. So to move it, I am going to subtract the 48x. Put it equal to 0. Now I'm going to factor. I can factor by doing the AC method or the guess and check. I'm going to go ahead and do the AC method just for practice. So we want to multiply 27 times 5, and you get 135. Now, because the last sign is positive, that means they are both going to be whatever the first sign is. They're both going to be negative. So we need to find factors of 135 that subtract to get 48. So just play around with your calculator. As you notice, I did a few random factors, and I finally found 3 and 45. Because 3 plus 45 is equal to 48. So I'm going to split my middle term. Group my first two together. That negative has got to go inside. And then I group my last two together. My GCF is 3x. I get 9x minus 1. And my GCF in the second group is a negative 5. And I get 9x. Remember, when you factor out a negative, it changes the sign. Now I'm going to factor out a 9x minus 1 times 3x plus 5 is equal to 0. Put each one equal to 0. Add 1, divide by 9, so x is equal to 1/9. And over there, subtract 5 and divide by 3, so x is equal to negative 5/3. Number 2, we have to get it equal to 0, so we're going to add 22x. And again, put it in standard form, so the 22x goes in the middle. Put it equal to 0. Now always, 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 always check for GCF. Do you have a common factor that goes into 48, 22, and 15? We do not. So we are going to factor by grouping. We're going to factor into two binomials. We can do the guess and check method or the AC method. We are going to do the AC method. So we multiply 48 times 15 and get 720. Now, because the last sign is negative, the signs are going to be different. So we want to find factors of 720 that subtract to get 22. So just play around with your calculator. Okay, as you see, it kind of took me a few factors, but I finally found it. 18 and 40. 40 minus 18 is 22. And I want the 40 to go, the positive to go with the 40. So I'm going to split my middle term. And again, it doesn't matter which one you write first. As long as the positive goes with the 40 and the negative goes with the, oh, not 22, 18. Factor by grouping, group the first two, group the last two. My GCF in the very first group is a 4. A 4x. So I get 12x plus 10. And my GCF is a negative 3. Now, I'm noticing something here. When I factor out a 3, 3 goes into 18 6 times. Well, I can already see that these two are not equal. But let me go back and look right here. A 2 goes into 12 and a 2 goes into 10. So a 4 for my GCF, that was not my greatest common factor. It should have been an 8. So I'm going to go back and erase. So that's why it's very important that you get the greatest common factor, or it won't work. So I see my error. I'm going to do it again. My GCF is 8x. And that's 6x plus 5. Now my GCF here is a negative 3. And I get 6x plus 5. Now I know I'm on the right track, because my 6x plus 5s are identical. So I'm going to factor those out. Put each one equal to 0, because the direction says to solve. If it's not equal to 0 and the direction says to factor, then all I have to do is factor and I'm done. But because the direction said to solve and I had to put it equal to 0, I now have to solve and get my x-intercepts, or another word, get my roots. Subtract 5, divide by 6. I should be able to do that in my head and get negative 5/6. Add 3, divide by 8, so x is equal to 3/8. Example 1, write a quadratic equation in standard form. Negative 1/3 and 6 as its roots. So we're going backwards. We're given the answer and we have to go and put it into the equation. So this is saying that x is equal to negative 1/3 and x is equal to 6. So put each one equal to 0. So we're going to add 1/3, put equal to 0. Subtract 6, put it equal to 0. And there's our two binomials. And just put it 1 equals 0. Now we have two binomials. We're going to do the FOIL method. Get x squared. My outside term is a negative 6x. My inside is a positive 1/3 x. And then 1/3 times a negative 6 is a negative 2. Now remember, standard form, you cannot have fractions. So I have to clear my fractions. I'm going to put this over 1, this over 1, and 2 over 1, and 0 over 1. My least common denominator is 3. So I'm going to multiply each term by 3. When I do, I get 3x squared minus 18x plus 1x minus 6 is equal to 0. Combine like terms, I get 3x squared minus 17x minus 6 is equal to 0. There is my standard form. One way I could check to make sure I did this correctly is I could factor and put each one equal to 0 and solve. And when I do that, I better get negative 1/3 and 6 as my answer. Example 1b, again, write the equation in standard form. So this is saying x is equal to 3/4 and x is equal to negative 5. Put each one equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract 3/4 and add 5. There's my two binomials, so I'm going to write them and just put 1 equals to 0. 1 equals 0, I mean. Now to do the FOIL method, I get x squared plus 5x minus 3/4 x minus 15 over 4. I have to clear my terms by multiplying each term by the least common denominator of 4. And I get 4x squared plus 20x minus 3 minus 15 is equal to 0. Oh, that should be a 3/4 x right there. Combine like terms. And there is the equation in standard form. That is the end of section 5.3 factoring.